History books and Hollywood have painted for us a rose-colored image of how Old West legends met their demise, usually in blazing gunfights at high noon. But the actual tales of how these frontier heroes died are sometimes more intriguing and sometimes more tragic than the stories we've all heard. We're learning today the true stories of the demise of 12 legendary American frontier heroes. Hi, history buffs. A reminder to subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the true history behind the legends before getting into these legendary stories. Prepare to learn about how your favorite Old West figures actually died. Some are going to surprise you. 12. Billy the Kid. Not so kid-like after all. Whereas everybody knows Billy, the kid passed away young. Precisely how he died is in contention for over a century. Sheriff Pat Garrett shot the 21-year-old outlaw to death on July 14, 1881, in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. What individuals do not know is Billy was not killed in an action-packed shootout. The true reality was that Billy had been attacked by Garrett in a darkened room within Pete Maxwell's ranch. The kid had gone out to cut himself some beef, and Garrett hid in the shadows and suddenly fired at him. Eyewitness reports have it that Billy's final words were, "Quién es?" Who is it? While Garrett fired into his chest. This dishonorable outcome is a far cry from Hollywood's idealized depictions of dramatic showdowns. The actual event was more of an assassination than an equitable duel and tested frontier justice that historians debate to this day. 11. Wild Bill Hickok. The Dead Man's Hand. The death of James Butler. Wild Bill Hickok is the most mythicized in the West's history, but an immense amount of detail has been absorbed by legend. Gaming poker with cash at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon in Deadwood, Dakota Territory. On the 2nd of August 1876, Hickok lethally erred by sitting facing the door, something he infrequently did. Jack McCall, enraged at a prior insult, entered and shot Hickok in the back of the head and killed him. The cards that fell from Hickok's hand, 2 pairs, black aces and eights, were the dead man's hand. But this is the one thing that no one knows. Hickok was breaking his own cardinal rule that day because the only other chair at the table had its back to a window. The legendary lawman was afflicted with glaucoma and may be losing his vision, perhaps partly responsible for the fact that he was not situational aware at the end of his life. His demise marked the closure of the frontier era of lawmen. 10. Jesse James. Betrayed by a friend. The assassination of Jesse James on April 3, 1882, is betrayal that may be second only to a Shakespearean play. Everyone is aware that he was shot in the back by Robert Ford, but the whole situation is more complex than that. James himself had invited Ford and his brother Charlie to his own residence and treated them like family. James had removed his guns for the day because it was hot as he cleaned a picture frame. Being in need of standing on a chair to reach it, he was an easy target. Robert Ford was not timid and shot James at the back of the head with a .44 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. What most people don't know is that the Fords had already negotiated a pardon and reward money with Governor Thomas Crittenden before the murder. The forgery was so complete that James had been plotting their final robbery with the brothers when he was murdered. 9. Calamity Jane. Not so flashy a death. As her nickname suggests, Martha Jane Cannery, better known as Calamity Jane, did not perish in an explosion of flames from a firework, but because her bowels were inflamed by alcohol. She passed away on August 1, 1903, in Terry, South Dakota, living a more complex life than the dime novels described. In her final days, she was found on the floor of a Belle Fourche hotel, ill and penniless. Legend or not, she died penniless. Her funeral was covered by the madam of a local brothel, and she was buried next to Wild Bill Hickok in Mount Moriah Cemetery. But their legendary romance equated to nothing more than that. What is less well known is that in her advanced age, she had worked as a brothel cook and occasionally for Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, peddling her celebrity to earn a living. 8. Doc Holliday. The tuberculosis, takes its toll. Gunfighter turned dentist John Henry. Doc Holliday did not perish from the bullets, but from the disease that had afflicted him his entire life. Tuberculosis claimed his life on November 8, 1887, at the Hotel Glenwood in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. His last words, witnesses said, were wickedly funny. Gazing at his bare feet, he demanded boots be brought to him, which was a dying wish to wear them, as in the myths. Informed that he was too sick, he allegedly said, "This is funny," amazed that after all the shootouts with guns, he was going to die in bed. Less famous is that Holliday had traveled to Glenwood Springs in the hopes that the sulfur gases from the hot springs would alleviate his symptoms. Instead, the humidity most likely hastened his deterioration. 7. Butch Cassidy. A death surrounded by mystery. The destiny of Butch Cassidy remains one of the Old West's most enduring enigmas. Although popular folklore has it that he and the Sundance Kid were killed in a shootout with Bolivian soldiers in 1908, there are numerous accounts contradicting one another. His family members testified that he went back to America and lived under a false name until the 1930s. There were reports by some witnesses of his presence at various locations years after he had been believed dead. His sister, Lula Parker Bettinson, reported him visiting her in 1925. What makes it the most interesting is that there were never officially confirmed bodies of Cassidy or Sundance, and Bolivian army records from the time are incomplete, and the world has had to wonder what became of them. 6. Annie Oakley, the Unheralded. Later years. Although Annie Oakley did not pass away in the correct Old West era, her death in 1926 ended a full chapter of frontier existence. Following a lifetime of miraculous shooting, she passed away due to malignant anemia in Greenville, Ohio, at age 66. Less well known is that she spent the later years of her life instructing women to shoot, intuitively believing in women's right to self-defense. She continued to give shooting demonstrations, even after a serious car accident in 1922, when she wore a steel brace on her leg, until a year before her own death. Most amazingly, she had spent many decades successfully suing newspaper publishers who had falsely reported that she had passed away in 1902 and had won 54 out of 55 libel suits against them. 5. Bass Reeves, the real Lone Ranger's last stand. Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, considered by most to be the Lone Ranger's origins, succumbed to Bright's disease, renal disease, in 1910. During his illustrious career, he captured over 3,000 outlaws, while his own life, on the other hand, quietly expired in his Muskogee, Oklahoma residence. What's especially interesting is that Reeves remained an active lawman until just 2 weeks prior to his death as a Muskogee police officer. He was 71 years old and still wearing a badge, one of the longest-serving lawmen in American history. Few are aware that later in life, he had to arrest his son for murder, attesting to his strength of character, no matter the cost to himself. 4. Pearl Hart, the Last Lady Bandit. Pearl Hart, said to be one of the last of the American West stagecoach robbers, did not die in some melodramatic holdup or shootout. Instead, she disappeared from public life in 1928, and with her went endless speculations about what had happened to her. There are some accounts of her retiring to a secluded life in California, using an alias until the 1950s. Others say she went back to Canada where she was born. Of particular note is the fact that her last reported appearance was working as a Buffalo Bill-esque Wild West show, milking her celebrity. That her death itself was a secret is proof of how easily even Old West celebrities like herself could become lost to the mists of time as the frontier period receded further into history. 3. Wyatt Earp, the Last Man Standing. Wyatt Earp survived most of his contemporaries, dying of chronic cystitis in Los Angeles on January 13, 1929. In his later years, he served as a consultant for early westerns, trying to set the record straight on his own life. What most do not realize is that Earp was one of the handful of Old West legends who lived long enough to see himself become a legend. He spent his remaining years attempting to find a publisher for his life, although his autobiography didn't come out until many years later, after his death. During his final days, he was a frequent visitor to the Hollywood boxing matches and acquainted with many of the early Western film stars, including young John Wayne, who in turn would cite Earp as an inspiration for his screen persona. 2. Belle Starr, a murder never solved. The Bandit Queen. Belle Starr met a brutal death, not by a bullet. She was ambushed going home from Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma, to her ranch on February 3, 1889. She was struck in the back with a shotgun and then repeatedly shot while in her death throes. Despite the large number of suspects, including her husband and son, she was never murdered. The most fascinating part is that she actually did predict her own demise, having left behind her will just days before. The mystery grew thicker when some of the potential witnesses were murdered under questionable circumstances during the months following her killing, suggesting some underlying scheme that was never cracked to this day. 1. John Wesley Hardin. The lawyer gunslinger's last case. John Wesley Hardin, who boasted of having killed 42 men, was shot in the back of the head while playing dice at the Acme Saloon in El Paso on August 19, 1895. What is so ironic about his death is that he had just passed the bar exam and was trying to leave his violent ways behind. His killer, John Selman Sr., was a lawman in El Paso, no less famous than Hardin himself. The assassination allegedly was because of an altercation over arresting Hardin's son, but a few historians question it was a result of Hardin's flirtation with Selman's daughter-in-law. Fewer still know that Hardin was in the process of writing his memoirs when he was killed, leaving behind an incomplete manuscript filled with insight on frontier violence. What is so precious about these stories is the manner in which they demythologize and give us a glimpse of the real people behind. These were not dime novel figures. They were complex individuals living in a world that was changing at a breakneck speed, trying to walk halfway between legend and reality. The way that we have remembered their deaths speaks as much about our need for heroes and villains as it does about what actually happened. Maybe that's why we are so fascinated with them to this day, because they remind us that even legends are, at the end of the day, human. What do you think about these true conclusions? Comment below and let me know what of these stories surprised you most. And don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of the real history of the American frontier.